but we only scratch the surface of the meaning of the book.
So the key again is hermeneutics. Context, context, context. Going back and seeing what's before and what's after if you're going to actually understand a confusing passage. I found it interesting that you pointed out Laodicea means to be ruled by the people. Isn't that an interesting argument you could use to support elder rule?
Yeah, that passage, Laos, people, Dikeo, ruling, Laodicea, being made up from those words, means the people ruling. And it's sort of funny, you mentioned progressive dispensationalists. They like to use that as what Jesus says to Laodicea there as evidence that the kingdom is in force. Well, if the kingdom is in force, Jesus is doing a lousy job running it because he's outside the door of his own church, trying to get into the church.
Let me in.
And so, people are into congregational rule. I mean, that's Laodicea. It's the people's whims ruling. And I think that's one of the reasons why a local church is supposed to be governed by a plurality of godly men whose character has to be confirmed according to specific criteria that Paul lays out in 1 Timothy 3:1-7. I mean, the function of a church is to bring believers to maturity. It's not to let the inmates run the asylum, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, in the same chapter, my grandpa just mentioned, you also mentioned several other things, right? Jesus is going to rule in the kingdom with a rod of iron. Obviously now, there's no rod of iron from what I can see outside of the church, in the church, right? There's still plenty of apostasy or people not following the faith. They're still saved, right? But they're not following the way they should be. Another thing is you talk about not just the rod of iron, but also talking about silence, right? People, progressive dispensationalists, they point to the New Testament and they say, nowhere does it say that Israel's still God's chosen people, right? You don't see in Matthew 28, Israel is God's chosen people. So they kind of argue from a silence of the New Testament, since it doesn't mention it specifically. How could you argue pretty well against that? So why don't you put it in your own words? How can we fight back against that?
Right. Well, just to be fair, I don't want to misrepresent people. I don't think now what you're describing replacement theologians do.
Okay.
But I don't think progressive dispensationalists have gone so far that they've chopped off Israel completely. They still believe in a future for Israel. Right. In my opinion, they've watered it down some because Israel is just one of many nations in the millennium, whereas my understanding of prophecy is she's the head, and not the tail. She's preeminent. But you're right. Replacement theologians think that an argument that doesn't mention Israel in the New Testament means that somehow Israel's program is canceled. Let's assume there is a silence, which, by the way, there's not, but let's assume there is. That in and of itself cancels nothing. I mean, if I tell students, hey, at the end of the semester, your paper's due, and I tell them that at the beginning of the semester, but I never mention it the rest of the semester, that doesn't cancel what I originally said at the beginning of the class.
The papers still do.
And so even if the New Testament is silent on Israel, the Old Testament has plenty of information telling us that God has a plan for Israel. By the way, why would God have to repeat everything that he already said in the Old Testament? I mean, we wouldn't need an Old Testament if that was so. If the New Testament just repeated the Old, I guess what I meant was we wouldn't need a New Testament if he's just repeating what's in the Old. So silence is not a cancellation. Now, having said that, it's true that Israel is not as prominent in the New Testament as it is in the Old Testament, but it is mentioned many places. Romans 11 being the most conspicuous. Paul says as clearly as it can be said, all Israel will be saved. The New Testament, Jesus says, you who have followed me in the resurrection will govern the 12 tribes of Israel. That's Matthew 19, verse 28. And when you get to Revelation 20 and verse 9, Satan runs an attack at the end of the millennium against the beloved city. I mean, what's the beloved city? It's the city of Jerusalem. Why is Satan attacking Jerusalem? Because he's not a replacement theologian. Satan isn't. He knows Jerusalem is the headquarters of the Messiah. So, cancellation is not, a silence is not the same thing as a cancellation. However, having said that, the New Testament does reiterate Israel, although it doesn't mention it as prominently as you find in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Let's go back a little bit. There is some confusion over the current roles of Jesus Christ. He's seated at the right hand of the Father. Some believe that that's also the throne of David, that the two are synonymous. Let's clarify the difference between the two and the roles that Jesus Christ plays in those two.
Yeah, right. Well, if you look, for example, at Revelation chapter 3 and verse 21, it distinguishes those two thrones. Jesus says to the church at Laodicea, "He who overcomes, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne." And the verb there is the future tense. "As I also overcame and sat down," I think it's Eris there, with my Father on his throne. So obviously there's two thrones. There's the current throne that he's now on, the Father's throne. And then there's the future throne on the earth in Jerusalem, Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, that currently is unoccupied. So what people are trying to do is they're trying to take those two thrones and merge them together. Now that will happen in the eternal state, but we're not in the eternal state yet. We're in the church age. And so those are two completely separate thrones. And so Jesus, to say he's on David's throne would mean I could go over to Jerusalem and shake his hand. Because David's throne is always, every single time, it's always portrayed as earthly. So Jesus is not on David's throne. He's on the Father's throne, and he's not functioning now as king. Look at the state of the world as an example. There's no Jesus ruling with a rod of iron. So he's not functioning now as king. He's going to be king one day, just like David in 1 Samuel 16 was anointed as king before he actually began to reign as king in 2 Samuel chapter 2 and chapter 5, because there was a usurper on the throne. His name was Saul. So in the same way, Jesus is anointed as king. We know he's going to get there one day. He's going to reign on David's throne, but right now there's a usurper that has to be deposed. He'll be deposed at the end of the tribulation period. And until that happens, Jesus can't be reigning on David's throne, reigning as king. Where he is now is he's at the Father's right hand on the Father's throne. He's destined to be king, but he's not yet reigning as king, because the book of Hebrews says right now he has a totally different ministry where he's functioning as high priest, after the order of Melchizedek. So Christ's three offices are prophet, priest, king. Prophet, first coming; priest, currently, in his current session. But the day in history will come where he will be king over the earth, and that won't happen until you have a repentant national Israel.
Yeah, let's say I understand that. I understand Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. He's interceding for us, right? Jesus is still in charge, but it's in a different way. Now the 1,000 years comes in, right? Jesus is crowned as the Davidic king. But after the 1,000 years, the earth is destroyed. How does that process work? Is Jesus still on the Davidic throne after that, after the earth is destroyed and made new? How does that process work?
Well, that's interesting. There's sort of an adjustment as you move from the millennial kingdom to the eternal state. And it kind of looks to me like the two thrones merge together at that point. I think you'll see that in, if I remember right, Revelation 22. in verse 1. Let me just, if I could, I'll just read that real fast. Revelation 22:1. It says, "Then he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb." So you don't see the distinction anymore between the two thrones like you saw in Revelation chapter 3, verse 21. But that only happens after the earth, as you mentioned, is dissolved by fire. Because God, through the last Adam, has already reasserted what was lost in Genesis 1. That's what the 1,000 years are for. Well, God wins. So now God is free to start afresh. And since this world has been contaminated by sin, he dissolves it by fire and replaces it with a new heavens and new earth. And so sort of the story of the Bible is from a garden to a city, with a cross in between. And with the asserting of Christ's regal authority, an already done deal, because the 1,000 years are over, we're free to. God is pretty good at starting over. You notice in the Bible, he starts over with 8 people after the flood, and then he disciplined that generation that came out of Egypt. So he started all over with their kids in Numbers 13 and 14. And here's just another example of it. The regal authority of Christ has been asserted. God is the winner of history, so let's just melt everything down because of the sin problem, and let's start all over with the new heavens and new earth. And that's when the two thrones merge together, but not beforehand.